guys, I am going to share with you today how to traditionally piece Jack's mouth. So we have our piece H is the dark color, the mouth, and we have our piece D's, and then we have piece G and piece F, just for the lay of the land. So we're gonna start with the mouthpiece and our two piece D's, and we are going to mark a line diagonally across the back. If you watch the eye tutorial on YouTube, you know that it is pretty much the same, just a few different pieces, and that I finger press my little squares like this. So you can definitely do that if you feel comfortable. And by finger press, I mean folding that square in half as perfectly as possible, pressing along the crease, making sure not to skew it because it will stretch a little bit. And then you have a crease on your square that you can use to sew along, or you can mark the line on the back side of the fabric diagonally so you can sew along that line. So let's get going. We are going to align with right sides together the square in the corner, and then we're going to sew along that line and trim this point off. So you can trim this point with a rotary cutter and a 1/4 inch ruler, or you can just clip it with scissors because it is small, just like that. So you have about a 1/4 inch between the edge and the seam, and then we're gonna press this open. A great tool for pressing open is a rotary cutter, so you don't have to be next to your iron and press all the time. We're gonna do the next piece. As you can see down in here in this corner, it's the same side and the same thing. Right sides together, aligned with the corner, and sew along that diagonal marked line. Then we're going to just trim off. So we have about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Trying to keep these points available. And we're gonna open this up. I have two mouth pieces here because you can see with Jack's mouth, this mouth is created by the two blocks next to each other so that the mouth is centered. So we're gonna fully piece one mouth, and then we'll fully piece the other side. So next we're gonna take piece G. We wanna sew it up here, and we wanna do that right sides together. So if you're not sure how to do that, I always align it where it goes and then fold over so right sides are together, realigning this top edge is the edge we're gonna seam on. And it's a 1/4 inch seam allowance throughout. Typically with quilting, a scant 1/4 inch seam, so that means keeping that 1/4 inch seam as small as possible is good. We pressed it open with just our fingers. Usually with a larger piece, that's enough. And then we have our last piece to sew on here, which is our piece F. This is how it is aligned in, and I'm not showing you the diagram and the pattern, but there is a whole diagram that shares this too with each individual piece. So we know we have to sew it right sides together. So we're gonna fold that over. We're going to align the edge and the corners, and we're gonna sew a 1/4 inch seam there. And here is our full eye piece. And if you have a little bit of a variance in like edges here, you can totally trim this down to 3.5. As long as it's just a tiny bit, not a big deal, because that'll be hidden in the 1/4 inch seam. So there is our one side of Jack's mouth. I'm gonna pop this down here. I have my paper pieced mouths down here, which I'm gonna pop the video for that at the end of this one. It is also in the FPP video. And this is just to show you what the paper piece pattern looks like. So we're gonna go back here to the opposite side. See, the only difference in this is that you're gonna sew on the opposite side of the first one. So on the first one, we sewed on the right, the little corners, and this one we're gonna sew on the left, the top, this piece G goes on the top of both of them, and then the piece F was sewn on the right of this one, the same side as the points. We're gonna do it on the left of this one, the same side as the points. So again, I have this one finger pressed, so I'll just sew that one right away, aligning it in the corner, sewing along that finger press, trimming it off, and pressing it open, either with your fingers, an iron, or a seam roller. Then we're going to mark a line on the back of this one. I really love this ruler. This is by OmniGrid, and it comes in a set of 3. It is 12 inches, and I know there's a 6 inch, and I can't remember if the 6 inch is what I use the most. I couldn't find that one. I think it's in my travel bag. And there's either like a 3 or a 9 inch, somewhere in the middle. It's 1/2 inch wide, and it has a mark right down the middle for 1/4 inch. This is awesome if you're doing 2 at a time HSTs, because you can align this line in the middle from point to point and mark your line on either side. And it's just a small tool, and I love the shorter ones even better to mark lines like this, because then you don't have to kind of wave around a really big ruler to mark all your lines. So I would highly recommend these. I've had these for literally years, so I really hope they're still available, but it is one of my favorite rulers. Okay, last piece aligned in the corner. Sewn along that marked line, trimmed so we have roughly a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and pressed open. The finger pressing works. You just have to be careful those points don't get stuck in a seam. Then we're gonna sew on piece G. It aligns like this. We're gonna fold right sides together and just shimmy it down to align with that top edge. 1/4 inch seam allowance here. Press that open, and we're gonna do our last piece with its piece F. This is the side it goes on, so we're gonna fold it over right side together and align with the edge. And sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And there we have Jack's Mouth. It's pretty easy. Same piecing technique as the eyes for this traditional piecing. The FPP I will share next. And I'm also gonna share in this video, because it's all about mouths, how to embroider the Anna and Boone mouths as well. Simple. So I already cut out a few little pieces to use today, so I'm going to do that. Just making sure to cut it the correct way. Which I did that wrong. Hold on, I can use it for that one. Okay, so we're gonna come over here. And I just shifted it a tiny bit. We just want to make sure we have about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so that has the strongest seam. Like I was saying before, I go through the seam allowance for my stitch, and then I either end at the next seam or I go 1 stitch past. You don't want to really go much farther than 1 stitch past, because it can hinder when you're cutting that seam allowance on a different side. Then our other one, which I'm going to cut this guy. And then this guy doesn't have a seam allowance on either side, so I try to end as close as possible. I have a garbage can down here, so that's where I'm trimming. Open that up and do that. And a good way, if you need to make sure that it covers your whole piece, is like hold it up to a piece of light, like, and then you can kind of see the shadow. This is my next piece. I'm going to align it for this piece up here. And then the only other tip I would say is because lighter fabric, you can see darker fabric through it on seam allowances. Make sure you do trim down any dark fabric so it's fully behind the light fabric for that seam allowance, because otherwise you might see it a little bit and it won't be awesome to see that shadow on your fabric. Okay, just cutting out this last little piece. I'm laying it over. Just gonna take a gentle peek to see where my seam will go, and I think we'll be fine. I can even use a little less fabric and stitch it up. Here we go. I'm gonna trim all that stuff off. Again, you can rotary cut that, so it's very nice and clean. There's a ruler called Add a Quarter, and it has a little lip so that you can bump it up against that seam, and then it gives you a perfect quarter edge to chop off. Just pull your paper away before you're cutting that off. Here is our pre-trimmed piece. I am going to go trim this down. Okay, I just trimmed them down. We have our eye and our mouth, and remember, they are not seamed in, so once they're seamed in, they'll have those perfect proportions. And this, remember, the mouth is only half of the mouth. You'll have the other half of the mouth, so it'll be centered. So I thought I would share how to embroider a mouth on your ghost. So this is a Boone, so we're gonna do Boone's mouth, but you can do whatever type of mouth you want to embroider. This is page 11 in the pattern, and it has kind of these lines that cross, and those lines you're gonna line with the seams of blocks to line up the smile. Then you're gonna use the smile to draw that on your fabric, directly on your fabric, and then we're gonna embroider that drawing. There's a couple ways you can draw it on. You can use like a pen that's a water-soluble ink pen, and you usually can find these at most quilt shops, fabric shops, Amazon. This is called Mark Be Gone. I don't know where I got it. It's water-soluble ink, so that means that once you're done with it, water will take the markings away. And if you're stitching directly over top, you could completely cover the marks, so it won't even matter. You can use a Frixion pen, which is the same thing. It's like, I think it's iron. Yeah, I don't use these too often. I typically just use a pencil. You just want to use something thin enough that you're not going to see tons of the marks after you stitch over top of it. But if you're unsure if that will happen, I would definitely use one of the ones that disappear. I would test it first. Water soluble, put a mark on, and then put a little water to make it disappear. And then the Frixion pen, which of course read the directions, the same thing. See, those are like little markers. And then a pencil just has a pencil mark, which you cannot erase. So let's try and get rid of the water soluble one. I've got this little spray bottle. See, it disappeared right there. Probably shouldn't have sprayed it on top of it looks like the Frixion pen is water soluble too. So we're gonna use that Mark Be Gone because I know that it goes away on this one. So I'm gonna set those to the side, and I'm gonna set this to the side. The other thing you are going to need is floss. I recommend DMC floss. Any type of embroidery floss will work. I am using 301 black from the brand DMC, and it's embroidery floss. It comes like this. This is a different color, of course. See, DMC brand. And the number will be here. You can find this in a lot of craft stores as well, and some art stores, and probably online. Any thicker thread will work. I know probably Aurifil 12 weight would work. So I am using that. It's pretty thick. And how I do it is I separate the 6 strands into 2 sets of 3 strands so that I can thread it on the needle. I'm just kind of pulling it down to separate. Go almost to the end. Okay, and embroidery needles are ideal because they have bigger, a bigger eye to thread through. So we just want to thread this. Okay, I have it threaded here. So I'm actually just going to smooth the thread out and pull the ends so they're even and knot it. I do it this way. You could just thread it and have a knot at one end and have a tail hanging up here, but I like it this way so that I can, I'm gonna clip that tail off really close to the knot. So I like it this way so I can catch my thread on the back. So before we start embroidering, we do need to mark it on our pattern. So it really helps if you have a window and you can tape this up to the window, and then you can hold your boon guy up above on top of this and line up these lines and then do it. I think we should be okay because it's light. If you have a light box, that works great, but basically this vertical line, I want to line up with the middle vertical line of his body. See, we've got 2 and 2, so the middle vertical line. And this horizontal line here, I want to line up with this line. It is the bottom of the block below the eyes, but I'm going to do that behind with this facing up. So I'm going to place that back there, and you can definitely see it through this fabric. I hope you can see that. I wonder how much we're going to be able to see it through, but it's just enough really to get an idea. Another way, if you don't have access to a bright window, sewing at night, this is how I often do it. You can find the seam lines and kind of just place that vertical seam along the vertical line and pull it down until you get this horizontal seam lined up over, and kind of hold it in place, pull it back, put your hand up here to hold it in place again, and then it'll be pretty much lined up. And then I can see the shadow of my mouth through there. And I am just going to trace right over that and go up. So that is Boone's mouth, and now I'm gonna embroider right over it. Okay, let's remove the paper. And we always start embroidery from the back because we want this knot to be on the back. And we're gonna do a back stitch. So a regular stitch is for embroidery is in and out evenly. And then when you pull it through, you have these stitches with fabric between. So for back stitch, it's basically the same thing. We're just filling in those holes. So on the back, I am going to put my needle through so it comes up on the front, right at the top part of his mouth, right in the middle of this line I made. And I'm gonna make my, pull it almost all the way through. My fingers are back here and they're kind of like holding the knot. Let's open up. See, I kind of catch the knot with my fingers so I don't pull it all the way closed. And then I'm going to put my first stitch in, and you want your stitches to be what, like 1/8 of an inch apart? I'm gonna pull this through to the back, and I'm gonna make sure that stitch looks nice on the front. And I'm gonna flip it over, and see I still have that tail. This is why I knot the thread like I do, because I'm gonna put my needle right in between the 2 sets of 3 threads, like this. And I'm gonna pull it through, and then I'm gonna pull it so that knot comes all the way down. That secures my mouth. Sometimes that knot can have a tendency to pull through the front of the fabric. And flipping back over. Sorry, it gets a little bit crazy. This, you might have to wrinkle this guy a little bit. You could use a hoop if that is more comfortable. You could also do a very light interfacing on the back, or you could draw your mouth on a piece of Solvy by Sulky. Solvy, S-O-L-V-Y, by Sulky, the brand, S-U-L-K-Y. And it's just something that, it's a fabric piece of paper that you can print on or draw on an embroidery pattern, peel the back off and like iron it, or I think it just sticks on. And then after you embroider, you dissolve the fabric that you stuck on in water. That gives it a little bit of stability because you want to be sure that you're not getting puckers with that mouth. So from the back, I'm just going to poke another stitch up and then pull it to the front. And now if I was continuing on with a running stitch, I would put this back here so we make another stitch and see how there's fabric between, but we want a solid line stitch. So I'm doing a back stitch, which means I go back to the beginning of that first stitch and put my needle right in the same spot pretty much and pull my thread through so it gives more of a solid line. And then I'm gonna come up again about the same amount. If your stitches get a little bit different size, totally fine. You won't even be able to tell from a distance. And I'm gonna come back through and I'm gonna go back to the beginning of my second stitch and pop it right in there and pull it through. So the trick is to pull those stitches tight, but then kind of pull it away. You don't want any of the separate threads in each stitch to pucker up, but you don't want the fabric to pucker up. If I pulled this really tight, you see how my fabric got that little pucker? Just kind of pull it apart and smooth it with your finger. That's kind of what the interfacing can do to stabilize, but if you're used to this, you don't really need to use interfacing. And it can make a thicker section or show through the fabric on the back of the face if you add interfacing in just one spot. So I would beware with interfacing. Again, I'm coming back up, pulling my thread through, going back at the beginning of that first stitch and pulling through. Now I'm going to show you what I do because it's a little bit faster. Is once I pull up my thread, and try not to get your needle right in that ditch because that is a little bit harder to go up right in a seam. Just go a little bit past it. And before I pull my thread all the way through, or you can pull it all the way through on this, I guess, and then instead of pushing it down to the back and pulling my needle from the back like I've been doing, I'm gonna rock my needle back up and do my next stitch. So I'm only pulling the needle up from the front. There we go. And again, I'm going back in the beginning of that stitch, rocking my needle up, and you can kind of see the point of my needle pushing against the fabric to get in the right location and pulling it down and through. Back in the beginning. And this is my last stitch. And then to get to the back, we want to end on the back as well. We do that last stitch and pull it through to the back. Make sure it looks good on the front, no puckers. Let's flip it over to the back, and we have this long tail. We don't want to cut it yet because we want to tie it off. So I like to take my needle and loop under one of those stitches and then pull it up through this loop to knot it. And I tend to do that 2 to 3 times just to give it nice and secure so that it doesn't ever come undone, because that would be sad if Boone lost his mouth. And then you can clip it, and clip it close because this is dark, and if you have a tail coming off of that, you might see it through the light fabric. And there we go, there's Boone's mouth. So that's pretty fun. The only difference with Anna is that she has a full smile and Boone kind of has a smirk. So for hers, you would just draw this smile and it'd be more of a smile. And you can do whatever you want. You could make whatever smile you want. I don't actually see any of the pin coming through. Maybe a tiny bit, but I'm just gonna do a quick spray with water and hopefully that will go away. And I think even if it doesn't go away now, oh yeah, I just need to get a little bit wetter than a spray. It would go away in the wash. So that'll dry just fine. And there you have how to embroider a ghost party mouth.